All right, it looks like we're at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Samantha Oakley from ALA's Public Programs Office. I'm pleased to introduce today's webinar, Media Literacy for Adults, Civics. Could you move to the next slide, please? Before we start, I'd like to make a couple of quick notes about our virtual classroom. Only our presenters have microphone access, but you are welcome to type your questions in the Q&A box. To send a question, move your cursor towards the bottom of the Zoom window and click Q&A. Please also use the Q&A window to communicate any technical issues with ALA staff. Please do not put technical questions in the chat window as they could be easily missed if it's very busy there. We will respond to your technical questions as quickly as possible. Also, note that this session will be recorded, so if you would like to review any of the information, you may do so via the archived version that we will send out within 48 hours. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is presented by ALA's Public Programs Office as part of the Media Literacy Education in Libraries for Adult Audiences project, which is made possible in part by a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this webinar do not necessarily represent those of the Institute of Museum and Library Services or of ALA. Next slide, please. As information providers and hubs for lifelong learning, libraries have always been resources for helping communities develop media literacy skills. Now, in the midst of a global pandemic and in an age when we increasingly rely on digital media for information and communication, these critical thinking skills are more important than ever. The Media Literacy in Libraries for Adult Audiences project is designed to support libraries in their efforts to improve media literacy skills of adults in their communities. By tapping the expertise of a diverse group of 30 thought leaders, this project has created a suite of free media literacy resources, including a practitioner's guide and a series of 6 webinars. In this webinar, which is the 4th in the series, Laura Saunders will be discussing the important role libraries play in the civic life of their patrons and how that role is shaped. Next slide, please. With that, I'd like to give a brief introduction to Laura. Laura Saunders is an associate professor at Simmons University School of Library and Information Science. She teaches and conducts research in the areas of reference and instruction, information literacy, and has a strong interest in the connections between information literacy and the spread of misinformation or fake news. She's also interested in social justice issues related to libraries. In April of 2018, she ran the No News Symposium, which brought together 80 librarians, journalists, and allied professionals to discuss collaborative responses to the challenges of misinformation. Laura has a PhD and a Master's of Library and Information Sciences, both from Simmons College, and a Bachelor's of Arts in English Literature from Boston University. We are so pleased to have Laura with us today, and with that, I'm going to turn things over to her.
Great, thank you, Samantha. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. And I want to give a special thank you to Samantha and Hannah for coordinating the logistics for today, and to Mary Davis Fournier and everyone at ALA. This has been such an amazing project to be a part of. And it's hard to believe that it was not much more than a year ago that I was in Chicago with them working on the first part of this project. And just so much has happened since then. But this has really been a fabulous project to be a part of. And it's something that I'm really passionate about. So I'm excited to be able to just be here, even virtually, with you all today and talk a little bit about civics and the civic life of the public library. So just quickly, I want to outline our agenda, which is to talk a little bit about what civics is, and in particular to give you my frame of how I'm thinking about civics when I talk about the role of the public library. And then to discuss why we might want to talk about civics in the public library, and then a little bit about how we might do that. So first, what is civics? I feel like we must all know what this is, but we are librarians and we love our reference sources. So I thought it might be helpful to just go to Merriam-Webster and look at the dictionary definition of civics, which is dealing with the rights and duties of citizens. And I realize too that the word citizens can occasionally be a little bit problematic these days. And so I just want to be clear that I am using this word civics, and I may occasionally default to the word citizens, but I'm really using that to mean all of us who are residents of the United States. And I am framing this in the United States just in terms of some of the particular legal codes and aspects that may go along with some of our rights as citizens, as well as obviously the institutions that we're dealing with. So here in the United States, we're part of what's considered a participative democracy, which means basically that we do have a role to play and that our elected officials are supposed to represent us and our views. And it also means that we have rights within our institutions. So of course, most of us are familiar with these rights, but just to touch on them quickly, and especially the ones that I think are going to be most relevant for our discussion today, it's helpful to remind ourselves that in the United States, we do have a right to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and that we also have a right to the pursuit of happiness. That one's a little bit tricky, but it is relevant here for various reasons. One of the things that I like to remind myself, when I was growing up, my father's best friend used to like to remind us that we have a right to the pursuit of happiness in the United States, not a right to happiness per se. And I think that is an important distinction. But to me, what this means is that in part, we have a right to a healthy, safe environment. That's part of what's going to make happiness attainable for most of us. And so I do think, again, that that's relevant here. And then, of course, we have the right to vote, which gets back to that participative democracy. That's one of our main avenues for making our voices heard and for electing officials that are going to represent us. Now, one of the things that is relevant to libraries that's not directly addressed in our Constitution is a right to information. So you will notice that I didn't mention a right to information on the previous slide, and you might also have already realized that there's no explicit right to access information in our Constitution in the United States. But it has been recognized, the right to access information has been recognized both in the United States and abroad as a human right. And in the United States, there have been some legal opinions that have been written that tend to describe the right to access information as an ancillary right or a supporting right. And what that means is that, according to these opinions, the right to access information underpins all of the other freedoms and rights that we have. What they mean by that is that we can't really exercise our right to vote if we don't have access to the information that tells us what it is we're voting for. And not just what is on the bill, but all of the contextual information about the various sides that are being debated that will help us to make up our mind about how we want to vote or who we want to vote for. And this is true of our other rights as well. So for instance, we can't help to create a healthy, safe environment if we don't have access to the information that's going to allow us to make the decisions to create that kind of environment. And so although there's no explicit right to information in the Constitution, it has been recognized as a supporting right. And although it's not explicitly there in the First Amendment, it has been codified both in the United States and internationally in some other ways. So one important document is the United Nations Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and specifically Article 19 of that declaration, which explicitly recognizes people's right to access, share, and use information. So this is an international document, and although it's not legally enforceable necessarily, I think it has a lot of symbolic value, especially in how widely ratified it has been in terms of setting a bar as to what our expectations should be. Another really relevant aspect is the Freedom of Information Act, which is often referred to as FOIA. So if you're not familiar with FOIA, this is a series of laws, one that we have in the United States, but that also exists in over 100 other countries around the world. And this law says that as citizens and residents of the United States or whatever other country it has been enacted in, we have a right to access government information. And so through the Freedom of Information Act, we are given mechanisms to request that that information be made available to us. Now, in many cases, the government has already made a lot of information available to us, but in other cases, that information either may not have been published in a way that makes it readily accessible, or it may not have been published at all, or it may not be easily discoverable. So FOIA allows us to send requests to have that information compiled and shared with us in more manageable ways. And of course, there are exclusions to the FOIA laws. There are certain classes of information which include classified documents and other kinds of sensitive or personally identifying information. But for the most part, this is a really important act that speaks to our right to access information and that has really enabled many different people, regular sort of your regular everyday person, as well as journalists and lawyers, to get access to information that has been really important in terms of holding the government accountable. And then finally, we also have freedom of the press in the United States. And we may not often think of freedom of the press as sort of our personal individual right. We're probably usually thinking about it as the right of journalists or people who work in journalism. But the truth is that freedom of the press is an important right for everybody who lives in the United States, because again, the role of the press is to hold government accountable. And it's only if the press is free to access information, to request information, to ask tough questions, to be able to sort of physically and virtually go into certain spaces, that they are going to be able to access, compile, and share the information that, again, is going to help us to make good decisions, and that's going to help us to hold people accountable. So I know this is a lot of background information, but I think it's important context in terms of thinking about civics and thinking about our rights as citizens and residents. It's also important, though, to recognize that with great rights come great responsibilities. Often when we talk about rights, we talk about them as individual entities that apply to us as citizens and residents. And we often think about them kind of just as our entitled right, just as something that we have been given. And while to an extent that's true, it's also important to recognize that part of our duties as a citizen, and remember that civics, that definition of civics referred to both rights and duties. Well, one of our duties as a citizen, I think it can be argued, is to engage in an ethical and informed exercise of our rights. And part of that means recognizing that our rights are only so good as we also recognize them in other people. So in other words, one way that this is sometimes framed is that my rights end where another person's rights begin. And so if I am engaging in my freedom of speech or my right to vote or my pursuit of happiness in ways that impinge on or offend or hurt somebody else, then I'm not being very ethical in terms of my exercise of rights. And if I don't have access to information, or if I don't understand the information that I have access to, then I may not be able to engage in a really ethical or responsible use of my rights, because I won't be able to make good decisions. And so again, I think that these are all important sort of contexts and background informations that we should have in our minds before we even start talking about the role of the library in the civic life of our patrons. But with that background, then, we can move into why should we talk about civics in libraries, and maybe in particular in public libraries? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think that I really, truly, firmly believe that libraries, and in particular public libraries, have an important role to play in the civic life of their communities. And one of the first areas is in facilitating access to that information. So if we have accepted the idea that people have a right to access information, and that in fact they need that information is necessary for their sort of full participation in our democratic society, then we can definitely acknowledge the role that the library plays in facilitating that access. And we facilitate it in so many different ways. Many libraries collect and make accessible government documents in various ways. We also obviously collect and make accessible many other kinds of important information, from medical and financial and health information. But we also make accessible the technology that at this point is almost ubiquitously required to access much of the information that our patrons need. And in fact, the United Nations, again, has recognized access to the internet as a basic human right. And we know that although we have strong infrastructure in the United States in many ways, there's still a really important digital divide, and we still have a lot of patrons who may not have access either to the infrastructure, the broadband and the Wi-Fi, or to the devices that are necessary to use those. And so the library can play a really important role in facilitating access to the technology that enables access to the information. Beyond that, though, we also promote information literacy. And so I've often argued, but I'm not the only person to argue, that physical access to information, or technological access to information, is really only a first step. We need access to information, but if all we're able to do is access that information and we really can't understand it, if we can't figure out what is the good and the bad information, if we can't make sense of what we're accessing, then that information really isn't very meaningful. It's not very helpful to us. So in fact, back in 2010, Paul Sturgis and Almut Gastinger wrote what I found a really influential paper discussing access to information literacy as a human right. And whether or not we want to think about it in those terms, I would absolutely argue that information literacy is crucial to understanding information and therefore to exercising all of those rights that we've already talked about. And again, I think that the library has a really important role to play in helping people to develop those information literacy skills. And I'm using the term information literacy as sort of a broad umbrella term, but as we talk more, I will kind of couch this in the language of civic literacy. So understanding civics and rights and responsibilities, as we've been discussing them here, as a sort of a branch of information literacy. And then finally, I think that the public library has a role to play in terms of encouraging civic engagement and discussion. One of the ways for us to exercise our rights as citizens and residents of the United States is to engage civically, to register to vote, to actually get out and vote, to participate in the conversations that are happening locally and nationally. And in order to do that, we need to have some information and we need to have some understanding of how all of that happens. We also need to be able to have those conversations. And so I think the library, as we'll discuss further, really has a role to play in terms of helping to enable those conversations and facilitate those conversations, and helping then to empower our patrons to really feel that they have the agency to engage in the civic life of their community. All right, so let's move on to talking about some big, broad ideas. So this is where we start to kind of narrow down from the broader information literacy to some of the ideas that are more specific to civic literacy, and kind of thinking again about the role of the public library there. So one big idea that I think is important to talk about is the idea of news deserts. And I'm sure this is a term that you've heard of, but one of the issues that we're facing in the United States is that as information models change, as the economic models of information change, we're seeing that there's a shift in terms of how media and journalism are working. And we're seeing consolidation in a lot of newsrooms. We're seeing declining revenues for a lot of our traditional media outlets. And in some cases, this has led to the folding of a lot of local newspapers and news outlets. And what that results in is what is sometimes called news deserts. And again, that term can be a little bit problematic because it really takes this sort of deficit look at the area that is being discussed. But it also acknowledges a serious problem, which is that local community news is often crucial in terms of people's civic engagement. National news is important as well, but national news can often feel very removed from us. And not only can it feel removed, but it often can feel like we don't have the agency or the power to influence things at a national level. But at a local level, we can, but only if we know what's going on. So the loss of local news has been really problematic. And there's also been arguments made that that loss of that loss of community local news has also helped to fuel some of the sort of partisan divides that we're seeing and some of the declining trust in civic institutions like traditional media outlets, because again, people just don't have those sources to go to anymore. So we might ask ourselves, well, what can a public library do about this? There are a number of things we can do. One thing is just, again, to kind of use our collections and use our resources to try and make as much news accessible as possible. But in some cases, some public libraries have taken this to a whole different level. So in Ware, New Hampshire, for instance, when their local newspaper folded, the director of the library there, who happened to have a journalism background, actually started a blog on the library page to share local news. And that blog is called Where in the World. And again, it's the Ware Library in New Hampshire. And there are links to all of these examples that I'm giving in the handout that Samantha and Hannah are going to share with you along with the slides. But it just goes to show that there are sometimes ways in which we in public libraries can kind of step in and fill gaps. Another thing that I want to discuss quickly is the marketplace of ideas. So the marketplace of ideas has long been important in terms of the areas of freedom of speech. And the argument of the marketplace of ideas is that if we allow freedom of speech and if we allow everybody to freely share their ideas and to freely debate them, then working together, we're going to be able to filter out the bad information or the bad ideas, and the truth or the good information is going to rise to the top. And this is a really compelling idea, and it's one that can be a sort of a useful framing when we're thinking about opening up civic conversations in our communities. But it's also important for us, in particular, I think in public libraries, to recognize the fact that the marketplace of ideas is also somewhat problematic. You know, one of the issues with the marketplace of ideas is it assumes sort of equitable access to that marketplace. You know, it's really only going to work well if everybody is able to have an equal voice. But as we know, there are always some voices that are louder and stronger than others, and there are always other voices that are, historically and continuously marginalized. The other thing is that, of course, social media has complicated the marketplace of ideas because it's really shifted how it's worked, so that now it's not just individuals or organizations that are sharing ideas, but there are bad agents and there are bots that can use those platforms and manipulate them in ways to amplify certain messages, to target certain messages to individuals who might be particularly susceptible to them. And it can really just kind of muddy the waters. So as we think about the ways in which a public library might be able to function as a marketplace of ideas, we also want to recognize the ways in which that marketplace is problematic and the ways in which sort of the goods and benefits of the marketplace are not equally distributed, and think about what we can do to try and make that marketplace more accessible and more equitable. I also want to discuss the idea of safe spaces. One of the challenges that we face in the library is that we're considered, public libraries in particular, are usually considered limited public forums, which mean that, you know, we are part of a government structure. You know, we run on government funding to a greater or lesser extent. And as a result, we have to adhere fairly strictly to things like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and things like that. And in many ways, it's a good, important thing because it is something that we have long recognized as an ideal of democracy. But at the same time, we also recognize that freedom of speech also means opening the door to very problematic speech. It means opening the door to offensive and hateful speech and things like that, that can make our spaces feel less safe and less welcoming to various individuals and various communities. And so when we are going to do programming, if we are going to try and enable civic discussions, if we're going to try and make our libraries part of the civic life of our community, we're going to have to figure out ways to balance these sort of competing interests. So we're going to have to find ways to try and make sure that our spaces do feel safe and welcoming while still allowing people to engage in that freedom of speech. And, and recognizing that along with, intellectual freedom, which is one of the sort of ethical codes and values of the library, we also have a value for social responsibility. And so thinking about how those two things can be balanced. And that brings me to the idea of civility. One of the challenges that we're facing right now is that with any kind of discourse, but maybe especially with civic discourse that typically involves questions of politics and society and sort of social issues, that the discourse is not necessarily always civil. And so this goes back to this idea of offensive speech and hateful speech and things like that. And if we are going to, again, sort of open our doors to the kinds of programming and the kinds of discussion and discourse that I am suggesting in this presentation, then we also have to think about how are we going to manage these things so that they are civil. And again, in the handout, I have shared some websites and some organizations that give us some really good guidance on how to offer this kind of programming and how to frame this kind of programming so that it will be more likely to be engaged in civilly. So things like the People's Supper or the National Week of Conversation and organizations and movements like that will do things like help us to think about how to set guidelines for interaction, ground rules for how we're going to engage with each other, and how to frame questions in such a way that they can be that they can provoke discussion without provoking a lot of emotion and a lot of vitriol, hopefully. And again, as we talk more about specific programming, I'm going to talk about some libraries that have used these models pretty effectively. And so that does bring me to my next topic, which is how do we talk about civics? So in other words, what kinds of programming can we engage in? What steps can we take to initiate this role that I've been discussing? And what models can we look to? Well, what I think is a sort of exciting way to approach this is through citizen journalism. So as I mentioned, one of the things that is important for us in society is that access to information and that freedom of the press, which both gives us access to important information and also helps to hold government accountable. But one of the challenges that we've been seeing is that there's been really steady declining public trust in the media, including in sort of historically well-respected media outlets. And there's lots of reasons why this is happening. But one of the reasons is that I don't think there's necessarily good, clear understanding about how journalism works and what is the difference between a traditional journalistic outlet, like, for instance, the New York Times or the Washington Post or something like that, as opposed to some of the things that might get shared on social media or some of the other kinds of news outlets that we might also be familiar with and all of the different kinds of things that are sort of framed as news that we're bombarded with. So one of the issues is that we don't necessarily have a good understanding of how journalism works. We don't necessarily know that there's a code of ethics that professional journalists will follow in order to try and minimize their bias in a story, in order to try and increase their accuracy in their reporting and things like that. And also understanding that traditional journalistic outlets go through a very strict editing process, so that there are lots of ways in which their stories are fact-checked and edited, and even if some mistakes get made, that those mistakes are corrected as quickly as possible. So I think one of the things that we can do in public libraries is to help people to understand how the media works, so that they can make better decisions about what media outlets to trust and what kinds of stories to trust and things like that. But some libraries have taken this a step further. So instead of maybe just running some classes or workshops that talk about what is journalism and how does it work and how do you evaluate a news story or something like that, there are some examples of places that have actually created news maker spaces in their libraries. And a couple of examples are at the Dallas Public Library, which partnered with the Dallas Morning News. And what they've done is a program called Storytellers Without Borders. And this program brings in local high school students, and they go through boot camp and they learn all of the nuts and bolts of how to create a real news story. And they actually then do create their own stories. So they're able to engage in topics that they're interested in, and they're able to carry it through from sort of the germination of an idea all the way through producing an actual news story. And so in this way, they are both learning the processes, they're also learning those news literacy skills in terms of how do you evaluate the facts and how do you evaluate the information along the way. And then in some cases, they're actually contributing then to the local news of their community. So they're also helping to fill some gaps there. And Dallas Public News and the Dallas Public Library are not the only places that are doing this. Now CASTA in San Antonio is another example where they describe it as the sort of local version of C-SPAN. And they also have partnered with the San Antonio Public Library to involve people in the creating and sharing of news stories. So I think that these examples of citizen journalism are great ways that we could bring these news literacy and media literacy topics into our public libraries in really engaging ways, and in ways that would let people sort of be active and hands-on, and that again could maybe then relate back to those ideas of news deserts to find ways to fill some of those gaps. And I also want to just point out that we don't always have to go this alone, right? The examples that I shared about Now CASTA and Storytellers Without Borders were accomplished through collaborations between the public library and their local media outlets. And those kinds of partnerships and collaborations can be incredibly effective in terms of making use of the expertise and the resources on both sides and leveraging that in various ways to get the most out of our resources. Another thing to get involved in is just this idea of civic literacy. So as I said, we in libraries, we play a really big, important role in terms of facilitating our patrons' access to and development of information literacy skills. And a branch of information literacy is civic literacy. What I mean by civic literacy is really just understanding how our government works at the local, the state, and the national level, right? Understanding, relatively what can seem like relatively simple or straightforward things like, how does a bill become a law? How does a resolution get passed? Who do I go to if I have a concern or a complaint about something that's happening in my city? I happen to have two kids who are high school age right now. And because of that, I'm able to see how government and civics is being taught to them right now. And it's also allowed me a chance to think back as well as best as I can to how I learned these things when I was their age, or to the extent to which maybe I didn't learn them as well as I wish that I had. And in the last maybe 10 or so years, I also had the opportunity to join my local public library's board of trustees. And even though that board has, a very narrow defined role, it's given me some insight into how my city works that I just never had before. And I think that public librarians, being part of that structure, have a real opportunity to share information with their local community and help them to learn more about how government works, and why it works, and how it can work better. And again, what their role is as the citizens and residents of that community, whether it's at the local, the state, or the national level. How can they get involved? Once they have this information about how it works, how can they use that information to affect good change in their communities? And again, there's lots of libraries that are doing some really cool things in this area. There's a program called speed repping that you may have heard of, that a number of public libraries have gotten involved in. And it's exactly what it sounds like. So just like in speed dating, you'll have people get together and they'll spend a certain amount of time, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever, in a pair, and then a bell will ring and they'll circulate around to their next partner. Speed repping brings local representatives into the library, and it gives patrons a certain amount of time to have a face-to-face, a one-on-one conversation with their representative. Whether this is a representative of their neighborhood to the local city government or a state representative. It's just a way of helping to kind of bridge between the government and the people that they are representing. Other libraries have done things like just run programming on how the government works. A lot of libraries frame this as something for new arrivals to the United States, maybe people who are working on citizenship and things like that. But I would argue that that this could be a really great way to engage all of our patrons, because in a lot of cases, they just may not be aware of how things work and how they can be more involved and better involved. Get out the vote. So, we just went through a really contentious election cycle, and I know that a lot of public libraries were right there in the fray. One of the issues, one of the challenges for a lot of people, as we saw this year in particular, because of the layer of complexity that the pandemic added, is that a lot of people are not, getting information on how to vote is often challenging. Every state and every locality does it differently. And there are different rules for how you register and different rules for how you access the ballot box, whether it's in person or by mail and so on. And it can be really challenging for people to navigate that system. And so a lot of public libraries have stepped in to try and make that information more accessible. So creating research guides, creating pathfinders and things like that, just finding ways to bring together all the information that someone needs in order to get themselves registered, figure out where they need to go to vote, or how they can request an absentee ballot and things like that. But in addition to just getting people to vote or getting them registered to vote, a lot of libraries are also doing things like helping to compile information on the issues and on the candidates. So for instance, the Queens Public Library has a really great active Get Out the Vote program. And again, lots of public libraries have engaged in that. And I think it's a really great role that we can play. And we can also think about how we can do this across a range of communities. So for instance, maybe engaging with local high schools where there may be students who are going to be close to or actually at voting age, and working with that with the high schools to help those young people get involved right away. So I want to return to the idea of civic conversations and the roles that libraries can play in terms of facilitating some of those conversations. One of the issues that we're having is that in a lot of cases, people aren't necessarily talking to each other, or they're talking, but what they're doing is talking past each other. And so again, a lot of this comes down to that that partisan divide, the fact that people on various sides of issues or on various ends of the political spectrum are getting further and further apart from each other, which is making it harder for them to talk to each other. And I think that public libraries, as those sort of public forums, as those marketplaces of ideas, can function in a lot of ways to facilitate those conversations. And just bring people together around important local issues and help them to think them through and talk them through and learn more about them. And again, there's lots of great models out there. The Boston Public Library, so near where I live here in Massachusetts, every year they participate in the National Week of Conversation, which is a national movement that a lot of public libraries tap into. And they use that National Week of Conversation to develop programming to bring their community together to talk about local, or again, maybe national issues of importance. And they can bring in speakers and run programming and things like that. But a lot of it is also about just facilitating conversation among the patrons. The Wilmington Public Library ran a series a couple of years ago called Revive Civility. And exactly as the title sounds, it was really about trying to get their community members to engage on these topics and to find ways to talk creatively and civilly around these topics. So again, they kicked off the program series with a keynote speaker who addressed a lot of important issues. And then they ran other sorts of programs throughout the month that included things like sort of meditation sessions to help people sort of get mindful and help to relax, as well as conversations and displays and things like that. So I think, again, there's a lot of really great models out there that we can draw on. And I want to point again to some of these organizations like the People's Supper that give us some tools to help us manage those conversations in productive ways and give us some guidelines in terms of how to help set ground rules to make sure that people are engaging in ways that are productive. And then finally, I want to just touch on the right to know, or getting back to those FOIA or Freedom of Information laws. This might seem a little bit more obscure, but it's something that I have become really passionate about in the last couple of years, especially as I've learned more about how people like journalists, as well as sort of everyday people, have used FOIA laws to uncover safety violations, hazards, corruption and things like that. And I think, again, public libraries can play a really great role in terms of helping people to understand what their rights are and also helping them to navigate the FOIA process, which is not always as straightforward as it should be. It does involve kind of identifying the appropriate agency that you need to request information from. It involves putting together a request that is going to actually get the response that you're looking for and things like that. So there's a great organization called Muckrock that, again, is on the handout, that has actually put together a completely streamlined online process for making FOIA requests. And it's something that libraries could easily tap into and share with their patrons and things like that, as well as doing programming, again, to just help people understand what their rights are and how to navigate them. So I want to just wrap up here by talking a little bit more about the responsibilities of the library. So just as I talked about, we the people have both rights and responsibilities, I would say that we the librarians, we have a big role to play, but that role also comes with some responsibilities. So again, remembering and recognizing our role as a limited public forum and realizing that that has some legal implications, and that it also doesn't mean that we can't push back on some of that. ALA has given us what I think is some pretty good guidance in the last year or two in terms of how we can frame our codes of conduct, for instance, to address hate speech and to try and limit the extent to which people would be able to engage in hate speech in our library by sort of defining when does speech become action. So we need to recognize our role as a public forum and also recognize the ways that we can manage that constructively, but also, really focusing on the opportunity that we have as a public forum to bring people together. We also have to recognize that in public libraries in particular, that we are accountable, that we're part of a municipal structure. And again, we're funded by our community. Anyone who's worked in a public library knows that. We have all at some point been told or reminded that the taxpayers' money pays our salary. But that's an important point. We need to remember that we are a part of this community and we are accountable to this community. And so we really want to take that role seriously and think about how we can engage that community in ways that are productive and in ways that will, again, empower people to work for good. And then finally, recognizing our role as a trusted institution. Now, I mentioned that journalism has seen a sharp decline in public trust, and that's true of a lot of civic organizations, including the government and Congress and so on. One of the civic institutions, one of the only civic institutions that has not seen that decline is the public library. Across the board, we are generally regarded as highly trusted, and that's a great place to be, and that's a great thing. It allows us a lot of scope in terms of engaging with our community, but it's also something that we want to recognize as a responsibility. When people trust us, that puts us, that leaves us with the responsibility to be worthy of that trust. And so we want to find ways to work with our communities to acknowledge that trust and to build on it in ways that are productive. So I'm stopping here with some sample discussion questions from one of the organizations that I mentioned in the handout, which is Living Room Conversations. They suggest some ways to frame questions that can be more constructive and get some good conversations started. So I'm going to stop there, and I want to open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you, Laura, for that excellent presentation. So we have about a little less than 15 minutes left for Q&A. Feel free to, I see some of you have already been typing your questions in the Q&A feature in Zoom. Go ahead and add those in there. You'll also see that we have the upvoting feature turned on. So if you see a question that you really want us to answer, feel free to upvote it. We'll try our best to get through as many questions as we can, but there may be some that we just won't have time for. So the first question here is, you referenced an article earlier about information literacy as a human right. Do you know where people can find that article?
Yes, excellent question. It actually is available online. At least in the past, there has been a freely available version online. And the title is Information Literacy as a Human Right. And the authors are Sturgis, S-T-U-R-G-E-S, and Gastinger. So it's pretty easy to find online, but Samantha, I could also email you the citation afterwards if there's a way for you to share it.
That'd be great.
Recording. Okay, great.
Yeah, we'll send out a link to the recording as well as a copy of the chat transcript to everyone after this, and we can also include that as citation.
Great.
Great. So the next question is from Mariana. What is the best way to respond when patrons see civic education as part of the politicization of public spaces?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it is one that I hear a lot. I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but what I usually tell people, and this is true even in my classrooms, right? In higher education classrooms, there's often this fear that we're indoctrinating students and politicizing the classroom and things like that. And so what I try to tell people is that my role as an educator, and I would say my role as a librarian, is to help people learn how to think, not necessarily to tell them what to think. And I would say that that's true when we're having these conversations as well. It's not to say that we don't all have our position, and the library may have a position as well, in terms of what would be best for the community. But I think that hopefully we can approach these conversations in an honest manner to say that what we really want, if our outcome is really to facilitate dialogue, that's different than if our outcome is to achieve a particular end. And so I think the more transparent we can be about what it is that we're trying to achieve, the better. I also think that we can acknowledge our role as information experts, in the sense that we're people who have gone through a lot of education and received a lot of training in terms of how to evaluate information. And so, I think we can share with people that we can help them in terms of evaluating information, again, in a way that is objective and that's based on criteria about what makes information and information sources reliable and trustworthy, without trying to give into that bias.
Great. The next question is from Lee. How about when we over-politicize public library boards that don't want to have their units involved in free expression?
That is an incredibly challenging situation. And I know that I've heard those situations. I've seen some of them in the news. I think it depends to some extent on the community and sort of how much oversight the board has. But I think one thing we can do is to think about our board as a partner, and to try and find ways to educate them about not just about freedom of speech and things like that, but help them to learn, like, what is the role of the library? What is our mission? What are our values? And to try and do some, one thing that I would love to see happen more is to do some onboarding and orientation for new trustees that doesn't just introduce them to this particular library and in this particular community, but really gives them an overview of the sort of mission and values of librarianship, to try and help them understand that. The other thing is, to an extent, if you're able to communicate directly with your community, the board is supposed to be the representative of the community to the library. And so if the community advocates for certain things or is supportive of certain things, the board should, in theory, be responsive to that.
Great. The next question is from Jenny, and they are wondering if you can name some libraries that are doing the speed repping that you talked about.
I had one noted down. I think I have one noted down on the handout, and off the top of my head, I can't remember which one it is, but there's a few of them, and I'll email them to you afterwards, Samantha, to reshare them. I think the Urban Library Council also had some information about that at one point.
Great. And then that also inspired a tag-on comment to that one. Could you provide some clarification of what speed repping is?
Yes, absolutely. So it can work different ways for sure, but essentially what it means is inviting government representatives, so whether that might be city councilors or state representatives or people like that, to the library for a certain amount of time, and then giving patrons a couple of minutes with each representative. So the way that like speed dating works, right? That if I'm the representative, and then a patron will come in and have 5 minutes to just chat with me. And then at the end of the 5 minutes, the next patron has their turn. And if there's more than one representative, the patrons could, cycle through the entire panel.
Great. The next one's a little long, so bear with me. I've been trying to think how to paraphrase it, and it's not coming directly. So it's from Aaron. When we speak of information literacy as a civic right for civic engagement for a healthy democracy, one of the aspects that comes into play is the idea of critical thinking to discern the genuine from the fake information. and they're referencing a New York Times article that speaks about how critical thinking is a pricey commodity with today's attention economy, and too much critical thinking might not be the answer to fight fake news. So, as library professionals, what do you think? How should we rethink the information literacy strategy to fight this problem around misinformation?
Yeah, excellent question. And that's a great article. So I would highly recommend that as well. Yeah, so the idea is that there's obviously more than two ways, but there's two main ways that we often will think about information. And one is we'll read very deeply, like we'll spend a lot of time with one article kind of parsing out all of the details and really thinking about what's being said here. And the other is to read sort of more shallowly and laterally, which is we get a piece of information from one news source, and instead of continuing to read that, we'll go to a few other places to try and verify that information. And what this research has shown is that that kind of lateral reading can be better for basic fact checking, and it can correct the misinformation more quickly than the deeper reading. So again, there's some research out there. Some of it is from people from the Stanford History Education Group, which I know is represented at the Media Literacy Forum. So some really great information. And the other person who writes a lot about this is Michael Caulfield, who has an open access textbook that explains how to do this. And so what I would say is we should probably be teaching both kinds of reading to and sort of fact checking to our patrons. And I think absolutely as information professionals, we should really be aware of the differences between the sort of deep reading and the lateral reading and when to use which kind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. And I see a lot of people in the chat showing love for the Stanford Education Group resources. So the next question is from Jenny. They're wondering about this marketplace of ideas and what the role, wondering about how this marketplace of ideas would play a role in allowing Proud Boy type or known alt-right groups holding meetings in our public libraries.
Yeah, excellent question. And I know that this is a really challenging one. And I know, of course, as many of you probably already do, that there was a lot of debate about this over the last couple of years when there was some different wording along the guidelines for meeting rooms and things like that. What I would say is, first of all, we have to sort of compartmentalize the legal issues and the ethical issues. And so legally, in public libraries, in most cases, we're going to have, if we have public meeting rooms and if we make them available to the public, my understanding, with the caveat that I'm not a lawyer, is that we generally have to make them available equitably to everybody. And so if there were a hate group, a known hate group that was looking to use our rooms, we may legally have to allow them access to that room as we would everybody else. Now, with that said, there has been some guidance in the past, and in fact, the Anti-Defamation League used to have some really good guidance about how to create meeting room policies. Unfortunately, I don't find that on their website anymore, but I do remember how it was framed. And I thought that it was quite useful. And basically what they would do, or what they suggested, is creating these policies that sort of clearly lay out rules of conduct and rules of behavior, and that are very clear. We can put limits in terms of time, manner, and place of use. It's only the speech itself that we can't necessarily regulate. So we can be very clear about how the meeting room can be used. And the other thing is we can, if we can reasonably say that there's an expectation of disruption or disturbance from a particular group meeting in our libraries, we can require that they provide and pay for a police detail. Now, again, there's legal issues here and there's ethical issues, and not all of these have been legally tested, and depending on how they are constructed, there may be loopholes there. But what I would say is, especially in public libraries, if we have access like to a general counsel through our, our local government, I would suggest using frameworks like that to work with them to create a policy that will stand up to a legal test, but that will give us the best, most, for lack of a better word, safest use of our spaces.
Great, and with that, we are actually out of time. So if you could just advance one more slide, please. We'll wrap it up. So thank you so much, Laura, for this presentation. It's been wonderful, and there's been a lot of great comments in the chat box as well. And we just really appreciate you being here. I also want to thank my colleagues behind the scenes, Sarah Osman, Mary Davis Fournier, and Hannah Arata for their support on this webinar. To hear more from Laura, you can follow her on Twitter at BiblioLaura. If you have any questions that we were unable to get to during this session, please feel free to email publicprograms@ala.org. We're more than happy to help you. Also, this presentation has been offered as part of the Media Literacy Education in Libraries for Adult Audiences project with support from a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The archived version of the session is going to be available on programminglibrarian.org, which within 48 hours. We'll also send it out via email to all of you. And thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.